Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, welcome back to the podcast, episode 10. Can't believe we've already done 10, Richard.
Wow, time flies.
Time flies when you're talking about Winston Churchill.
Oh, that's for sure.
As we noticed last week, we're probably not going to do two-part leadership profiles every week.
I'm going to try to control myself.
Yeah.
But I get pretty excited about leaders and biographies.
Yeah, as we know, as we look at this 3,000-page tome.
Oh, yeah, it's glorious.
So, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, that was part one of our new series that we're going to try and do perhaps once a month, do a leadership profile and talk about some of the biographies that Richard has read and just some of the information and the life of some great leaders throughout history. And so this is part two of Winston Churchill. Last week, we barely made it through his adolescence. But this week, we're going to look at some of his older years and really where he starts to shine as a leader. So, Richard, can you take it away on the more prominent years of Winston and maybe what he's part of his life that he's actually known for?
Yeah, well, Churchill, for some people especially, it's important to look at their childhood just because it does drive so much of what they become later. In fact, a lot of the great leaders had difficult childhoods. In fact, Churchill himself, when he was writing about his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, said most great men come from unhappy childhoods. They're trying to overcome a lot, trying to prove things to people.
Yeah.
But when you look at Churchill in his adult and later years, he's a person that, like a lot of leaders, his strength also is his weakness. And so his strength is that he's courageous, he's willing to take risks, he's a fighter, he doesn't like sitting back playing defense, he wants to be on the offense. And so that can work in his favor at times. He's aggressive, he's going to take the fight to the enemy. At the same time, when you do that, you can also make mistakes. You can get beat back. And so oftentimes he was willing to take risks, but sometimes those risks didn't pan out, and which would lead to apparent failure. And so some of his strengths certainly was his courage. Even as a young man, he realized that if he was ever going to be a famous person or be able to win political victories, he had to be a person with a reputation. And so even as a young man, he joins the army and travels around the world, goes to a number of battlefields, is involved in a charge in the Far East, cavalry charge where he's almost killed. He goes and fights in the Boer War in South Africa and is made a prisoner of war, but then he escapes and travels overland, in a famous escape. He ends up in Cuba for a while. I mean, he's all over the place. And he does a number of things that make him quite famous, really, is because of his daring. A lot of that daring, I think, comes from the fact that he was bullied when he was a child. He was neglected by his father. And so he's desperately trying to prove he's a man. I sort of feel like it's a little bit like Theodore Roosevelt, who was plagued with asthma, and his father had to take care of him. And so he's always trying to prove that he's tough. And so perhaps the toughest president in some ways was one of the biggest sissies as a child. And so Churchill does a lot in his youth to prove he's a man, that he's tough. Even his drinking, people say that he learned in the army that if you're a real man, you're a drinker. And so Churchill is sort of famous for drinking. He started off the morning with scotch or various hard liquors, and he drank all day long. When they hit a real financial tough spot in their marriage, his wife told him he's going to have to cut back on his alcohol consumption because it was costing quite a bit, and he he drew the line at one bottle of champagne a day. Yeah, he said, I just don't think I can go below that. But
That's moderation, I tell you what.
But so he develops this sort of hard living, at least persona. But he is a courageous man, and he's fearless, and that's proven over and over again. But also because of that, he tries a lot of things, and a lot of times it's not successful, and ultimately that leads to some political setbacks as well. But then when it comes to the military, he in World War I, for instance, is in charge of the Navy. One of his greatest failures was that in the killing fields of World War I, the generals they couldn't think creatively. All they knew how to do was what they'd always done, and that led to trench warfare. Basically, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were just mowed down by machine guns and cannon fire on those killing fields between the two trenches, and the generals didn't know what else to do except just keep herding more soldiers to their certain deaths. And Churchill actually decided to try a naval attack back through the Dardanelles that were back over by Turkey area. The only reason most people who look at that move believe it might have been the most brilliant tactical move of the whole war, but the problem was it was so daring that the Army was hesitant to back up the Navy. And so it ended up that because Churchill was only in charge of the Navy, not the Army as well, that it was not coordinated properly, and so it ultimately failed. And so everybody always criticized him and said, how can he lead anything militarily when he had such a horrible setback? But historians look at that and say that attempt, what he was trying to do is to come around the backside of the enemy in their weak spot, and if he had been successful, it would have turned the whole war upside down. And so it was a very bold move. And his problem was he wasn't in charge of everything yet, and because of that, he couldn't make everybody do what he said.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, it led to a failure. And for years later, even when that was in World War I, in World War II, he was still being criticized for that because of that failure. But Churchill, in fact, he ultimately had to resign from his head of the Navy after that, and in disgrace, he actually joined the Army and fought on the front lines for a while in World War I, which was a killing field. He was the kind of guy who'd go to the hard places, and people always liked working with him. The soldiers always liked working under him. Churchill had a way of inspiring people, even in the most gloomy of places. He would boldly be, spying out and surveying the territory where people would be trying to get him to take cover and protect himself. But just had a fearlessness that inspired people.
Yeah.
And in World War I, he is credited as being the first real promoter of the tank. And again, in World War I, it was not used widely.
Yeah.
But in World War II, it basically prevented fighting from getting just bogged down in trench warfare again. Tanks could sort of overcome trenches and machine gun fire and break through lines, and he is the one that really pushed it in World War I. Of course, they were very rudimentary tanks, but Churchill was always exploring and willing to try new things, which in a lot of military establishment, you didn't do that. You just went with the tried and true principles, even if they were continually failing. And so that was a lot of it. And when you notice, he's like a lot of people, like George Washington. Washington lost more battles than he won, but he won the important ones. And Churchill's kind of like that as well. He, in the beginning of World War II, once he takes over, the leadership of Britain before had continually appeased Hitler. They didn't want to fight him.
Right.
They were trying desperately to give up anything just to not fight. Well, Churchill comes along and he's willing to fight, and he does launch a number of different attacks against the Germans, but he doesn't have, he's basically all alone, just the British at that point, the only major power. Russia is allied with Germany at that time, and the United States isn't in the war, and France is out of the war. So he has limited resources, but he still tries to keep launching different attacks. And most of those don't work. The first 2 or so years, most of the assaults that Churchill launches fail. And so you could look at his record and say, well, he loses more battles than he seems to win. But the fact is he's a fighter. Hitler always kind of hated Churchill just because he was the one guy that wouldn't be bullied. It didn't, even if he was grossly outnumbered and everybody told him he couldn't win, he'd still be punching back anyway, even just for the sake of just striking a blow.
Well, and I think you can see how that really inspires your followers if they see you out there on the front lines really swinging and going at it. Like that's certainly an inspirational quality to have as a leader.
Yeah.
To just go take the fight to the other side.
Well, I think sometimes, the fact you're just not willing to quit, the fact that you're not daunted by the enemy, that you're constantly pursuing answers and solutions, and you might not have them yet, but you're not giving up. As a leader, I think that inspires people to say, this guy's got fight.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to make the distinction between just being dogged about something and never changing,
right,
and constantly failing, versus what Churchill does is he keeps trying to find the right solution for the problem.
Right.
So he may fail a lot, but he doesn't back down from it. Like he gets back up and tries something else and tries something else and tries something else until he finally comes to a solution.
And in World War II, after Germany defeated France, everybody was waiting for Germany to invade Great Britain. They fully expected that Hitler would launch an invasion across the English Channel. And so everybody's common thinking was, let's build our defenses. Let's get ready for the invasion. Let's not deploy any of our resources fighting in Greece or some Norway or some other place because we need all of our defenses here in England. But Churchill refused to sit back and just wait for Hitler to come attack him. He kept wanting to take the fight somewhere, to the continent or to Africa, or just hit Hitler somewhere, keep him off guard and keep him having to fight somewhere else, which probably in the long run did help. It's always been the problem of people like Hitler and Napoleon. They could never get their continental armies into England. They could never get across that channel. And that has been the defense of England, is the fact they're an island. Yeah. But so instead of just sitting back, he took the fight to Hitler. And there's a book, there's a series of books on famous people and leadership. It's a certain leadership genre. There's a book called Churchill on Leadership, the subtitle Executive Success in the Face of Adversity. It's written by Stephen Hayward. I've got a number of those. They're okay to read. They're sort of a mix of biography and leadership writing. I've got one on Robert E. Lee on leadership, on the Founding Fathers on leadership. I've got one on Spurgeon on leadership. There's a number of different books like that. Sometimes they're a little slanted, and of course, but they usually highlight some of the well-known facts about leaders. And so, the one on Churchill is it sort of pulls from the biographies, but it does emphasize some things. One of them being Churchill's a person of action. He wanted to act. He didn't want to discuss. He didn't want to just have another meeting. He was the kind of person that when you had the meeting, it was, okay, what are we going to do? And I think that does separate great leaders from mediocre ones. Some leaders want to consult about action. Great leaders take action. And Churchill oftentimes pushed back with his military generals. He always had his own opinions. And for the most part, people feel like he was always one of the best informed people in the room. He read voraciously. He got up every morning and read all the incoming reports. When he was in a meeting, few people probably were better informed than he was. And he would push very hard for his ideas. But it's said that if his generals stood up to him and said, no, we can't do that, rarely, if ever, did he override his generals. He'd push as hard as he could and try to win his case. But if they just said no, most of the time he didn't override them. He did listen to counsel. In fact, he really kind of liked. He was seen in some ways as a bully. He at one point with his own son, he was talking away, and his son was talking, and Churchill interrupted him, and his son pushed back because he hadn't finished what he was saying. And Churchill famously said, "Stop interrupting while I'm interrupting." He could be a hard person in a conversation. He dominated the conversation oftentimes. But at the same time, if his generals just held their ground, then he yielded ultimately. He recognized expertise, and he didn't want to break up the chain of command. But he wanted you to debate him, and he wanted people that would push back with him. Not people that were just stubborn, but people who had done their homework and had thought things through. And so Churchill was often bouncing ideas off, and at times it could drive his subordinates crazy because it was like he had 100 different ideas every day, and maybe only one of them was a spectacular idea. You had to weed through 99 that would have been disastrous or just misinformed, but then there was that one jewel of an idea that just could be a turning point. And so he was just this guy constantly thinking. And you got to realize he was a senior adult in World War II. So this senior adult who could just be living in the country, in his country estate,
collecting seashells and
painting and
drinking a scotch.
Instead, every day, this guy is just, his mind is going all the time, trying to think of a solution. He's working late into the night. And I think that also just is inspiring. And so it's easy to find quotes and actions of his that were disasters. And it'd be easy to pick him apart and say, well, actually, more of his ideas were bad than good. But he did surround himself with people that would cull out a lot of those bad ideas. He would let people override him if they really pushed back and saw that there was some danger in what he was suggesting. But he was able to push through enough ideas that were good ones and daring ones. And I think he sort of felt like that was his role. He'd seen World War I, where the military leaders were way too timid and uncreative. World War I was one of the most uncreative wars probably ever fought, where people were just stuck in just a bloodbath, but they couldn't think of anything else to do except pour more soldiers into the killing fields. And Churchill, I think, was just determined that we've got to be more creative than that. There's got to be other ways to fight without just needlessly costing a lot of people their lives. And Churchill was a very compassionate person as well. He was aggressive. He was a fighter, but he also grieved over the loss of British soldiers. He knew he didn't have a lot of them. He didn't have nearly as many as Hitler had of his soldiers, and he didn't want to waste them, and he certainly didn't want to lose a life needlessly. But at the same time, he was a fighter, and he knew that Hitler needed somebody who would stand up against him.
Yeah.
And Churchill, for a time, was about the only big-time leader that was willing to do that.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it sounds like he's taken the philosophy that a lot of technology startups take today, which is sort of the ethos is, fail fast.
Yeah.
So you just fail and keep going.
That was the great thing about Churchill. He had a famous quote where he said, success is failing repeatedly, but without loss of enthusiasm. And his philosophy was keep failing, but then if you keep failing long enough, you're going to come across success. You'll stumble on the right answer. And so Churchill, very much that describes his life and his career. Steady failures, repeated failures, and yet ultimately great success.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple more questions, but let's take a quick break here, and then we'll try and wrap up Churchill.
All right.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. If this sounds like something you're interested in, the next workshop dates are October 24th to 26th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until September 30th, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. We'll also leave links in the show notes.
Well, there's just a ton of information, and there's a ton of life lessons, I think, that we can learn from Churchill, and especially a lot that we can apply to our own leadership. Something we've already touched on is the failing fast and not being afraid to attempt things. What are some other lessons that we can apply from Churchill into our own leadership? What can we take away?
Well, I think maybe just the overall lessons from Churchill. One is that find what your purpose is. Churchill always felt like there was a purpose for his life, something great he was destined for. And it wasn't really until he's about 66 years old that he finally gets to that point. Everybody else had given up on him, but he still believed there was a contribution that he needed to make, some great contribution to society and history that God put him on the earth for. And it took a while for him to find it, but he never lost that hope and that confidence. And he was also never discouraged by failure. He never quit. I think that's a huge lesson for people is just don't quit.
Yeah.
You may have had some huge adversities. Churchill faced bankruptcy a number of times. In fact, one of his chief sources of income till he was prime minister was libel suits. He was always being slandered and maligned in the press, and he would constantly launch lawsuits protecting his name and reputation, and he typically always won those suits. And I mean, he fought so many of those, it actually was a primary source of income for him. And so he's being criticized and misrepresented and mocked, and yet he doesn't give up. He doesn't lose hope. And then certainly, as we've said, he was a person of action. I know a lot of leaders who love to cast their vision, love to talk about their dreams, but they don't get to acting. And Churchill got restless when people just talked. In fact, he was famous for demanding that any of his people reporting to him put their reports on about one page of paper. He didn't want to read through reams and reams of paper. He wanted to have them get to the point. What is the point? What should we do? Just state the facts and then have your recommendation for action. And I think that's a great lesson for leaders. Reduce everything down to the basic, here's the issue, here's the possibility, here's the action that I recommend that we take. And get up from every meeting with an action plan.
Yeah, and I think that's great even for people who may not be the leader,
right,
but who are in an organization where they have the opportunity to share.
Yeah, and I think, even if you're maybe you're a middle management or lower management person, or just you're invited to the table at any level.
Yeah.
Before you leave the meeting, ask yourself, so what am I going to do about this? You might not be in charge, but there may be, if you're at the table, if you're in the meeting, then it may well be that there's something you can do. And so don't just sit in meetings and then walk away just having and do nothing as a result. Always be asking, so what action should I take? Maybe it's a minor action. Maybe you're not the key player, but there might be something that you could do.
Yeah.
And become a person of action, which is what Churchill was. And at a time when everyone else was giving up. In fact, even his own party, there were those suggesting that he should just work out the best peace terms he could with Hitler. When he first became prime minister, one of the very first issues was just work out an honorable surrender to Hitler.
Yeah.
And he said, no, we're not going to do that. There's still things we could do. We're not going to stop acting. We're not going to quit. And I think that is what his key role was. He'd never quit in his life. And now England needed somebody who was willing to refuse to quit as well, but to say there's still something I can do, so I'm going to do that. And so I think you could take that away to say at whatever stage in your life or your leadership, there is a purpose God has for you. There is something that you can do. Don't be discouraged. Just do that one thing. And today, you might not win the war today. You might just win a small skirmish today. You might just hold on today. But in time, if you'll just keep on doing that one thing that you still can do, it could lead to a huge breakthrough and even a glorious victory down the road.
Well, that's great. And, we're going to try not to make every leader profile a two-parter, but I think we'll give special privilege to Winston and all that he represents. And so thanks for taking us through his life and just drawing out some of those key principles that we can take away and start applying today. And I hope this has been helpful for you as you've listened, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.